Hey, millionaire. These days, Hollywood stars and musicians are the biggest celebrities out there. But for a long time in our history, writers were up there with actors and singers as the superstars of the day. But we all know that today's rich and famous celebs can still go broke. It was no different for great writers, even when they had legions of fans all waiting to buy their newest novel. In fact, many of the most famous writers who ever lived died without a penny in their pockets. Some missed their chance to become famous, but others were even dumber and lost a fortune. This is our list of the dumbest famous writers who went completely broke. Number 6. Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was one of the most famous writers of his day. He was a real celebrity, known for being as wild as his name suggests. He was most famous for his plays, which were praised for their wit and Wilde's incredible storytelling ability. He only ever wrote a single novel, but that didn't matter, because the theater made him even more famous than most of the actors playing the roles he wrote. He once said about himself that, "My life is a scandal." He had no idea how right he was. Unfortunately for Wilde, he was alive at the wrong time. When the Marquis of Queensberry accused Oscar Wilde of sodomy, which was then illegal, Wilde didn't back down. He kicked off the court proceedings that would lead to his bankruptcy when he basically dared the Marquis to prove it by suing him for libel. Sadly, the Marquis had proof that his claims were true. After all, Wilde had been in a relationship with the son of Marquis, who accused him of homosexual acts. Wilde had to pay his own legal fees, and the Marquis also sued him for the fees of his lawyers. Wilde then spent 2 years in prison. He was broke by the time he got out, and he was forced to move into a rundown hotel in Paris. It was the next best thing to being homeless. He died in his hotel room from meningitis soon after, at just 46 years old. Can you hit subscribe before another writer quits their calling for a more stable job? You have about 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yes, before you ask, that happens a lot. Keep watching to find out which surprising name took our number 1 spot. Number 5. Herman Melville. These days, everyone knows Moby Dick, but you might be surprised to learn that Herman Melville's classic never made him famous. It was another novel that gave him a taste of fame. He spent his 20s on ships, sailing to faraway islands, which inspired his first novel, Typee, a fictional version of his real adventures. This novel was pretty financially successful, and so was his follow-up, called Omu. But even though they were popular, these books were lighthearted, and Melville wanted to write something more serious and experimental. That's where Moby Dick comes in. Unfortunately, this novel that's considered a standout today was Melville's first major flop. His finances started plummeting, and he was forced to start working as a customs official to make ends meet. It wasn't long before he was drowning in financial problems. He died from heart problems in 1891, about 30 years before Moby Dick suddenly became famous, thanks to the praise of other renowned writers. Number 4. Philip K. Dick. If you don't recognize the name Philip K. Dick, you'll definitely recognize some of the blockbuster and cult classic films based on his work. Blade Runner, Minority Report, Total Recall, and A Scanner Darkly are all based on his brilliant sci-fi books. However, he was writing these epic novels in the mid-1900s when sci-fi wasn't exactly celebrated. This meant that any kind of real fame was out of his reach for a long time. Even though he published a whopping 44 novels, a lot of them are considered important now, but the only real attention he got during his life was when he got the Hugo Award for his novel The Man in the High Castle back in 1963. That prestigious award earned him some attention from readers, but it was only in 1982 that it looked like he was finally standing on the edge of fame and fortune thanks to the release of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, which became a huge hit. Sadly, soon after, Dick called his therapist, saying he was suddenly going blind. His therapist told him to go to the emergency room, but he didn't listen. Unfortunately, his therapist was right. He was having a stroke. When he suffered a second stroke, he was rushed to the emergency room. But when the doctors told his family that Dick's brain had stopped showing signs of life, they made the difficult decision to remove his life support. Sadly, his story ended there before he ever got to see how famous he'd become. Who's your favorite writer of all time? Do you know if they died broke or if they became rich and famous? Tell us in the comments, and keep watching. We're getting close to finding out which famous writer took our number 1 spot. Number 3. Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka stands out on this list for being the only writer on this list who died broke because he didn't want his work published. He lived a pretty tough life, with an aggressive father and a mom who didn't defend him. His two brothers tragically died when Franz was only 6 years old. Later, his two sisters were killed in a Polish grotto during World War II. Franz had studied law at the University of Prague and later got himself a job in insurance, but he hated it. At night, he'd go home and write the brilliant work we all know him for today. He only made one attempt to make a proper living as a writer when he moved to Berlin in 1923. However, he never found out if he would have been successful because he passed away from tuberculosis a few months later in 1924. He said while he was alive that he wanted everything he ever wrote to be burned when he died. Lucky for us, his friend Max Brod didn't listen to him. When Kafka died, Brod immediately started publishing all of Kafka's novels, short stories, and even some of his beautiful letters. Kafka fans will be pretty grateful that Brod refused to burn all of that beautiful writing. Number 2. Joseph Roth. Austrian writer Joseph Roth was one of the few people on this list who were super famous while they were alive. He was a very known political journalist and novelist. Surprisingly, he was earning a lot of money compared to other famous writers. His novel, Radetzky March, was very popular when it was first published, and it's still considered one of the most important novels of the 20th century. Unfortunately for Roth, he was a Jewish man living in Berlin who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time when Hitler suddenly gained power. He immediately packed his bags and left for Paris, but his mental health seemed to have been pushed too far. His wife was suffering from schizophrenia, and he'd lost a lot of his income when he was forced to run away from Germany. He had also developed a severe addiction to alcohol, and that would be what ended his life. When he tried to quit, the withdrawal was too much for his body to take. He died penniless in Paris in 1939. And finally, the dumbest famous writer who went completely broke is number 1, Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is still one of the most famous writers today, best known for his horror short stories like The Raven, which inspired more horror movies than we can count. He's also often credited with inventing the whole detective genre. That's pretty impressive work, and it was rewarded. Poe became the first ever American writer who earned a living just by writing. But that money wasn't enough for Poe. He liked gambling and really loved alcohol. Plus, he had no financial management skills, which is probably why he found it so easy to spend insane amounts of cash on alcohol. By the time of his death, he was basically penniless. But the story doesn't quite end there. His death is so mysterious, it could have come straight out of one of his novels. In 1849, Poe left his home in Virginia for a trip to New York, but he never arrived. He totally vanished, and we still don't know where he was during this time. A week later, he was found in an alleyway in Richmond. He was behaving very strangely and was even wearing someone else's clothes. He was never able to explain what happened before he died in the hospital 5 days later. We still don't know what happened to him in the week he was missing or what caused his death.